E a Unidas cumprimenta todos os patrocinadores e apoiadores, parceiros deste congresso.
Nossos patrocinadores: Abbott, AstraZeneca, Benner, BSF, Clínica São Genaro, Cora, Fácil Informática e Impacto, Gestão OPME, Grupo Oncoclínicas, Aptec, Healthways, Hospital Sepaco, Influence, Intersystems, MV, Optum, Placi, Sabin, Sanofi Pasteur. Apoiadores: Accord, Américas, Bayer, Beneficência Portuguesa de São Paulo, Biotronic, Cooper Médica, Cristália, Forbio, Funcional, Grupo DASA, Grupo Santa Celina, Hospital Albert Sabin, Hospital 9 de Julho, Hospital São Camilo, LexisNexis, Oncoprod SAR, Real Hospital Português, Salutes, Takeda Oncology, Unimed Aeromédica, Universe.
E agora vamos iniciar o terceiro painel do 20º Congresso Internacional Unidas, cujo tema é A Saúde Amanhã. Convidamos ao palco o jornalista Augusto Nunes, mediador do Congresso. Convido Nick Goldemon, médico, engenheiro elétrico, professor da Universidade Erasmus de Roterdã, que abordará o tema Criando Novos Valores e Abordagens nas Relações da Saúde, o que a experiência holandesa nos inspira a arregaçar as mangas. Por favor, Nick. Francisco Balestrin, médico, presidente do Conselho de Administração da ANAP, que vai falar sobre o futuro dos hospitais, o Hospital do Futuro. Eu convido também ao palco Carina Hilders, médica, diretora-geral do Hospital Renia de Graaf, na Holanda, que vai falar sobre liderança médica hoje e amanhã. Com a palavra, o mediador Augusto Nunes.
Bem, vamos para o terceiro painel. Vamos ouvir Nick Goldemon. Com você.
Bom dia. Thank you very much for the kind invitation to this beautiful country, lovely people. It's been really a great honor. I'm Nick Goldemon. I'm from the Netherlands. I'm working for the Erasmus School of Health Policy and Management. And we are a research education institute, and we work internationally across the world, looking to different healthcare systems like China, Russia, Europe, and a little bit Brazil. So I want to tell you something about our work and what we see in general trends in healthcare. So the things I want to discuss is the socioeconomic trends and the impact on healthcare, the healthcare transformation and the trends in that, some words on health and technology, and last but not least, how can we co-create, develop solutions to anticipate the challenges. So let's start with the socio-economic impact on healthcare. So, as you know, aging is a major issue for many countries. That's for Europe, for the Americas, China and Russia. We're all dealing with the same developments. And one indicator to express this impact is the Age Dependency Index, which is the relation of elder persons to working persons in society. In 2007, in Europe, this was on average 1 to 4. 1 elder person and 4 working people. And this will dramatically change over time. So we see in 2050 that on average in Europe, it's 2 working person for 1 elder person. In the Netherlands, we are relatively lucky because we have 3 working for 1 elder person. But you can also see there are countries who are really facing massive challenges with even less than 2 working people. And do imagine, these people have to earn the money, they have to clean the streets, educate the children, provide the care, let the economy grow, and to pay the debts back from the economic crisis. And you can see from this that basically aging and health is an economic challenge, a major economic challenge for the coming decades. And if you think that economies like China will do differently and the growth of the economy will save this in the end, it's even worse there. So globally, aging has an impact on the world economy, especially if you take in consideration that with age comes the problems. These are figures from the Netherlands in 2005, where you can see that for the population of between 65 and 75, more than 50% of our people have 1 or more chronic conditions, meaning they are more dependent on the care system, on the social system, than healthy people. And some of the people say, well, our life expectancy is growing, so why bother? We are more healthy. Well, actually, that's not true. The figures show, the trends show, that yes, our life expectancy is increasing, but our healthy life years is decreasing. We're getting increasingly more ill at an earlier age. And countries like China are developing chronic diseases much more faster than we had, for example, in Europe. So also there, we see a trend in aging and also in more sicker people. And this is also true for the Netherlands. Although we have a relatively healthy population, we face our challenges. Consider this number of people available for providing care. And this is a picture from an American magazine depicting all the people involved in the care of this person. Bypass surgery. You can see, a child can make the calculation. We don't have the people, the resources, to wait till the problems are there and then start treating. So this institutionalized care, which consumes a lot of resources, isn't sustainable in the future. And also, if you're looking to the finances in countries, and here you see for different countries displayed the growth of the income and the general domestic product compared to the income of people and the health expenses. And you see that the health care expenses growing more rapidly than the income of a country and the income of people. And basically, if we continue, countries will more or less be bankrupt by this. See the US, 80% of GDP, they can't spend it on education, they can spend it on other important infrastructure, disasters, etc. So we really have a challenge here, a financial challenge. And there's a documentary from the BBC on the internet. It's from Panorama, and it's about the healthcare system in the UK. And it basically tells the story of a collapsing system in the city of Liverpool. And this is very similar in many cities where we do our research. So we have a time bomb of systems collapsing because the resources are not there, the people are not there, and the financial resources are also decreasing. To start with a positive message, no. Of course, we have a challenge, but there are some ways to anticipate this. So, what I've described in the previous slide if you would characterize our healthcare systems, globally it's very much institutionalized. Hospitals, big organizations, large overheads, rehabilitation centers, psychiatric hospitals, etc. Not so much involvement of local partners or organizations in providing care, and not so much involvement of the community in taking care of each other. In general, there are good exceptions. And often the care provided is monodisciplinary oriented, so no teamwork. Well, if you look into the vision papers globally, you see more a picture like this. So you see a relatively smaller role of high specialized cure institutions, a much broader role of institutions organized close to the community, in neighborhoods, offering a broad range of services, not only medical, but also social, or whatever service is needed for elderly people or people with chronic conditions. And a strong involvement and connectiveness of the people in the society in taking care of each other. And this is without exception how policymakers look into the future of healthcare. So already for some years we are already thinking about what kind of model could be applied to make this successful. And this is already some 20-25 years ago that the integrated care or the chronic care model was developed. And this is a sort of framework typically used by policymakers, by hospital boards, and it shows, okay, what kind of ingredients do we need to make this transition successful? And so at one side you see a healthcare system, on the other side you see the community, and you see, for example here, information systems. For a more integrated, connective approach, information is key. Information exchange is key. Healthcare is a very intense, information-driven process. So if you don't connect the systems, if you don't exchange the information in a very fluent way, it's very difficult to organize integrated, connective care with each other. So that is an important condition. Decision-making. Decision-making in healthcare is a complex thing. We measure, we have clinical reasoning, we make decisions, and we have protocols for that to help us. But if you take in consideration an elder person with maybe psychological problems, social problems, then we have also decisions to make together on, okay, what we should do, not only from a medical perspective, but also from a social perspective, etc. So there are different stakeholders involved in this process. So this is much more complex than just taking a decision on a medication or not. And so we need also support in this. Technology can help, multidisciplinary collaboration can help, redesign of the system and services. We should think on more self-management, that people take responsibility themselves in staying healthy, or the management of the disease, or maybe the family involved in this, if someone is not able to. The role of the environment, a supportive environment. So this is not only the street or the transport, a supportive or accessible buildings. A supportive environment is also a work environment and an employer which supports you with staying healthy or managing your disease. It's also your home environment where you can think of creating an environment, a context which helps you to change your lifestyle. So we have to have a broader perspective on how we embedded this in our society. Schools, education, work, the private situation, the sports club. It's more than that. Public health prevention is obviously important. And it's very difficult to get the community involved. How do we do this? How do we engage with our family and friends and our patients to make this successful? It's a challenge, but we know that these are the key factors to make it successful. And here below, you see here the team approach, not only a GP, a general practitioner, not only the specialist, not only the psychiatrist, but they working together, social worker with support staff, with the team approach and dynamic interaction with the patient who's better informed and supported by his family. That is the idea. And we have also the evidence in many countries that this could work. So this is a totally different view on what we are typically used in providing services from our organizations. Because it requires that we think about the patient need instead of, okay, what can I provide as a provider in a service? I provide diagnostics services or treatment services. So it's a more integrated approach, and as an organization, you should collaborate, be dynamic and interactive to see how you can meet the needs of the patient. And if you think along this process over time, it's more like a journey. Because we know that in diseases, think about child oncology, think about schizophrenic patients, think about palliative care. These are journeys which are often strongly fluctuate in the type of needs people have. And sometimes it's very medical oriented, but the next moment it may be social support, the involvement of education or another professional service. So this is quite a challenge, but if we want to improve outcomes and quality, we have to think how to do this. So the patient journey is an important discussion current in our professional groups. Another discussion, which is quite dominant at the moment, is value. So what is actually value for the patient? Are we talking about blood lipids or blood glucose? Or do we mean something like, I want to go shopping, I want to be with friends, I want to have more energy? So often, value from a patient perspective is composed on a combination of factors, and not only the tumor factor reduction. So that's another ongoing discussion, and we are not there yet, but it's good that it started. And we have the discussion more from a professional side. Okay, we have had this evidence-based medicine and all this evidence in literature. How do we combine this with our daily expertise? It's when the patient is sitting in front of you. How do we apply that? And how do we take in account the patient values in decisions we make together? And that's a third discussion which is really in the arena for the moment. So it comes together in this more integrated approach, more personalized. And there are different ways on how we could make our healthcare better on this. So going a bit more into detail. So how would it look like? If we're looking to a patient journey, often we see a stage where there are no problems, then a patient enters the systems, there's an intervention, and there's a recovery, the continuum of care. Ideally, such a system would be easy accessible. We are professionals. We know how the healthcare system works, usually. But citizens don't often have a clue how it works, the whole logistic process behind. So if we make the navigation through the healthcare system more easy, make it easy accessible in a sort one-stop desk approach, we are able to do the first screening, the triage of the problems. And then we have the logistical process of diagnostics, assessment, and intervention. Usually, or ideally, we would this in a sort of team approach where we have a case management with different disciplines working together with a multidisciplinary team treatment plan, medical, social, mental support, etc. And these disciplines, professionals working together. It's important that at the start of the process we do a proper triage. What is low complex care and what is really complex care? Because we know if we can tackle the more easy question on a low level, it takes less cost in order to do what's right. And then we have more resources available for the more complex cases. And ideally, this multidisciplinary care plan is supported by evidence-based medicine, our own clinical expertise, and the values of the patient. And this can only work with the use of technology, because you need this information exchange. So this is typical a sort of structure which, for a sustainable healthcare system and process to produce better outcomes. And if you're looking at this triage of making decision, what's really needed for professional care and what can the patient do himself, it's also a sort of synergy where the low complex problems, we should support, endorse that people take more responsibility for themselves, while the more complex cases, there should be more professional involvement. It requires really an integrated approach. But we saw over the last decades that there are different forces which create this fragmented system. So we have this professionalization. So over the last decades after the World War, we made all kind of a trend of professionalization in professional groups, disciplines, in organizations like you, like payers. And often when this trend of professionalization within organization, they tend to be a little bit looking inwardly in working on quality and process improvement, which is okay, but it tends also to increase fragmentation. The same is true for specialization. When you increase specialization, and today we have very, very specialized disciplines, especially in the curative sector, it also tends to further fragment the type of care you provide to the problems of the patients. And in many countries we have this decentralization where responsibilities are transferred more at a local level, and there's also a challenge of fragmentation in care and not integration. And fragmentation in general produces higher cost, creates more risk for patients, etc. So we have this trends ongoing, which does not really help to work together. Obviously, financial systems and incentives can also increase further fragmentation and competition, as what Michiel was explaining. So this integrated approach towards people in providing this holistic oriented care, it requires integration. And there are requirements for this. You see the lowest level here is sharing information. And although in Netherlands we have fantastic IT within hospitals, GP practices, we have one problem. It doesn't communicate with each other. So although we have a great infrastructure per organization, between organizations it's still a challenge. So we need consultation. We know as doctors how time pressure is often difficult to do all kind of consulting with each other. But it is really an important issue. And so there are all levels in collaboration which are important to make this work. And you cannot also have the view or more at the organizational level. So, for example, with a hospital, you should probably have a connection with primary care partners, with the municipality, with social care, etc., if you are thinking about helping a patient before he comes in the hospital and after discharge, how do you collaborate? So there are all levels of integration, and we have nice models for this. And they just explaining about the complexity and try to summarize it, condense in a picture like this. And so you have this operational aspects, which I showed you. But we have another issue, and which is more social related. So what kind of values do we share together in the way how we treat patients? How do we work together? Do we share the same values of quality and safety and efficiency? And so the operational part is often complex, but we also find that mere the social aspects are maybe even more complex to work together. As sometimes you are competitors, but how do you realize this collaboration with each other along the care continuum? The story I told about integrated care and about this patient journey, nowadays you see this story back in value-based healthcare. And they are so very different. Integrated care and value-based healthcare are pretty much aligned with each other. Value-based healthcare is more popular, but basically it's using same sort of concepts. You see here the patient journey, and you see here the different elements of care working together, aligned to anticipate the need of patients. Working on a better outcome for a lower price, more value for a lower price. So Porter defined this, brought the supply chain-based model to healthcare, and this is very good, because the industry have a long history of improving processes along the logistical chain of care. So we indeed see many approaches used for many years in industry apply to healthcare along the chain, along the patient journey, with Six Sigma, which is aimed at variation of practice. So how do you standardize all kind of interventions and actions at the work floor in order to increase the efficiency? Very functional, very useful. Yeah, only one remark. It's a very, I think, well applied now in many hospitals. But if you're looking across the hospital, after discharge, for example, after hip fracture, a patient going to a nursing home or directly to the home, so it's not much thought behind the walls of the hospital or an organization. And the same applies for the process before the patient enters in the hospital. So it's good, value-based healthcare and this type of approaches. But the next step is to think beyond the institutional care perspective. Lean management, focusing on remove waste, also to increase efficiency and theory of constraints, all kind of methods which could help us to increase efficiency and quality of care. And this comes together yet in value-based healthcare, in integrated care, and this is a good approach. But you have to understand we are still in developing the right models for this. I think if we're looking to the needs in the future, we have to do more with fewer resources because we don't have the resources. So if we fail, it will only mean or we can't treat all of our people, or we have to spend more resources. So we really have to think how we increase the efficiency and doing more with less resources. So this is our challenge. Okay, technology certainly can help. So if you typically look at the health status of a world citizen or a citizen in the Netherlands, people grow old and they consume during their lifetime care, hospital care, other forms of care. And at the end stage of life, the consumption of healthcare is at the highest level. While if we are able to increase healthy life years, we can also do something about these higher demands. And technology can help in the different phases of people's life and health. So we see a lot of technologies currently who can help you to maintain your health if you're healthy. Before midlife or during midlife. We see increasingly also technologies available for managing your disease, if you have a disease. At an older age, the consumer electronics and a smarter home can maybe help you to living more independently, and especially at the level of curative care, we see also all kind of developments. So we see a lot of progress, a lot of conferences about technology and innovation, and that's good, in different for different health statuses. So if we zoom in, for example, in cardiovascular treatments, you see companies like Philips, they want to deliver an integrated approach. It used to be also in these companies, we're just delivering an MRI scanner or another type of product, but usually it was not so integrated. While these companies like Medtronic, Philips, Siemens, they try to provide integrated solutions, including the services, which is quite interesting. So we see a lot of interesting developments there, not only from a technology perspective, but also from a service perspective. We have to think how we can make use of this. On the other hand, we see a lot of developments in the consumer electronics, which can be used by consumers also to stay healthy, to work, to have disease management. But it's a big problem. How do we connect the consumer side to the medical side? How do we do that? How can we make use of smart wearables, about apps, and connect this with the treatments, for example, in a hospital or in a GP practice? You hear a lot about exponential medicine and about the sort of big data and applications in medicine. And the idea is that we have a lot of data available from research and literature, from genomics, metabolomics, how disease interacts. And this, ideally, it maybe could help the local community in staying healthy and providing better care. And I think that's partly that's true. It could help in certain aspects. It may be also the case that we collect a lot of data about health, about what people are doing, about the preferences, and feed it back into the systems. And then you have the potential to create a sort of strengthening loop of providing information. There's a result in patients, in the community, and feed it back, and so you create this sort of intelligence. Although very much of the discussion is about more the application of prediction models and genetics and etc. And if you really look into the strength of these models, it's not so good. Also prediction, single genome determined diseases like Duchenne, it's relatively simple. That's a good prediction. But if you look into chronic diseases, like the development of diabetes or cardiovascular diseases, it's much more complex. And a little bit of promise that we can do better with more data is really overhyped from a medical point of view. So there are some concerns in this discussion. How do you use this application? Is this more from a physiological point of view or from a healthcare point of view? I think we are really underestimating the role of technology in the operational part, who people working together, and this efficiency. This is a far more bigger challenge than, let's say, the more biomedical approach. So this connected community and the role in providing more personalized care, I do think that's more important and save more money and better health outcomes. So one challenge is interoperability. Interoperability is how systems, data, technology, services, rules and regulation are aligned with each other. Because if this is not aligned to different levels, it stays fragmented, and accordingly, healthcare will be fragmented. This is what I want you to show. We did a study in the Netherlands on the forecast of healthcare growth, and you see here the spending, the current spending of in healthcare in the Netherlands. Here you see the prediction, the forecast for accountable for the demographic change, the chronic condition and aging. And here you see the rise of expenses due to medication and technology. So technology tend to increase, a lot of technologies tend to increase healthcare expenses. So really think about if you're in the next conference with all this very enthusiastic boys and girls, which is great, but we have carefully look, okay, what's really useful and contribute to better outcomes at a lower cost. So a few last words on co-creation. How do we can create solutions together? So the creation of new services, the implementation of technology, we have to do it together. We have a lot of evidence that we should use local communities or regions in order to redefine healthcare. There you have all the stakeholders around the table, and it should be a sort of joint effort to think about how we provide, for example, falls prevention in elderly. How do we organize better diabetes management? So we have to do it at a local level, together in a joint idea. So they're all type of methodologies developed over the last years, how to do that, how to include patients, payers, doctors, etc. Everyone who's relevant for the discussion round the table and discuss the issues and develop also the solutions together. So we did a big project in Europe on the co-creation on patient care pathways. So here you see the patient care pathway where we let the patient formulate the issues along the journey. So when the patient enter, for example, primary care, what were the experiences, positive and negative, in the hospital, after discharge, the monitoring, recovery, etc. And this was a nice way, with all stakeholders together. We had here policymakers, payers, industry around the table, and brainstorming about, okay, how are these issues, how they are related with the different categories in providing healthcare, what are the solutions? So there are many tools available in doing this together. But this is not only a thing about a group of people. You should also think, how can you organize and align policies and incentives at a higher level? So in Europe, we have the European Commission. At the European level, we have the national countries, the regions, and it has to be aligned in order to support the local community in this co-creation approach. You should have room for experimentation available and include the different stakeholders. And the other challenge is, how do you upscale the good practices to other regions and countries? Just one thing, we had Francisco Ballestrin in the Netherlands last week. And it was really nice because we discussed all the things in the Dutch system on healthcare. I posted on LinkedIn and we had more than 4,000 views. So many were interested in what we are discussing, and we can learn a lot from each other. And you see there Francisco in front of a Rembrandt picture in the Hague, which is the anatomy lesson of Professor Tulip, a early Dutch anatomist. So it shows how we can establish this kind of collaboration. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Nick. Vamos já para a segunda exposição. O Francisco Balestrin vai falar sobre o futuro dos hospitais e o Hospital do Futuro.
Eu queria, evidentemente, agradecer, né, o convite que me foi gentilmente feito. Eu queria que isso fosse, e agradecer em nome do Aderval exatamente esse convite que foi feito para nós. Queria cumprimentar aqui os meus colegas de mesa, que são participantes como nós, e queria também fazer um cumprimento especial a todos vocês que estão aqui e que representam exatamente aquilo que de melhor nós fazemos do ponto de vista de gestão de saúde no nosso país. Eu vou falar um pouquinho para vocês. A agenda vai ser exatamente essa. Muito rapidamente eu vou falar que a ANAP, eu não sei se todos vocês conhecem o que é a ANAP, vai ser bem rápido. Falar um pouquinho a respeito do hospital do presente, que afinal das contas, se nós vamos mudar de uma posição para outra, a gente tem que saber muito rapidamente como é que nós estamos posicionados aqui hoje. Falar, consequentemente, quais foram os impulsos para essas mudanças que vão acontecer. É óbvio que o NIC já teve a oportunidade de falar várias delas para nós, porque muitos esses impulsos de mudanças eles vêm de fora para dentro e não de dentro para fora, ou seja, a sociedade exige que as instituições mudem, como exige não só que as instituições hospitalares mudem, como exige também que aqueles que fazem a gestão de saúde mudem, como que os nossos políticos mudem, como que todos os órgãos de alguma forma mudem. É a sociedade exigindo mudanças. E com isso nós vamos ter o futuro dos hospitais. E depois que eu falar do futuro dos hospitais, eu vou falar rapidinho para vocês a respeito do Hospital do Futuro. Muito bem. A ANAP, ela é uma associação que reúne eu diria para vocês, os 100 melhores hospitais brasileiros. Eu posso dizer que são 100, porque todos esses hospitais, de alguma forma são certificados, né? Para estar dentro da ANAP, as instituições elas necessitam ter uma certificação internacional, ou a americana, ou a canadense, ou mesmo a ONA3, para que possa estar dentro da ANAP, exatamente porque o que a gente quer e nós temos excelência como princípio, e as instituições são essas, que de modo geral vocês todos conhecem. Eu acho que de alguma forma, em algum momento, ou já discutiram contas, ou já discutiram pacientes, ou já foram internados, ou já foram, de alguma forma, tiveram alguém lá. São exatamente os nomes dos diversos locais. O ano passado, essas instituições elas tiveram esse faturamento em torno de 28 bilhões de reais. O Brasil tem 6.200 hospitais, eu acho que vocês todos sabem disso. Mais ou menos 1/3 desses hospitais são públicos e 2/3 desses hospitais são hospitais privados. Desses 2/3, 50% são privados com fins lucrativos e privados sem fins lucrativos. O Brasil só tem 2 tipos de hospitais, os públicos e os privados. Não existem hospitais privados e filantrópicos. É hospitais públicos e privados. E os privados é que são divididos com fins lucrativos e sem fins lucrativos. Isso que é importante. Portanto, a ANAP, ela tem no seu bojo hospitais privados, com fins lucrativos e sem fins lucrativos. Tem o Einstein, tem o Círito, os hospitais da Rede D'Or, várias instituições que a gente conhece por aí. E aqui vocês podem ver que nesse 26% de todas as acreditações internacionais estão dentro dos hospitais da ANAP, no Brasil como um todo. E algo que é importante, 21% de todas as despesas da medicina suplementar, elas são realizadas nesses hospitais. E, sob o ponto de vista daquilo que significa despesas hospitalares, esses hospitais significam 45% de todas as despesas hospitalares de medicina suplementar, o que, na realidade, traz para essas instituições uma responsabilidade maior, porque nós, juntos com vocês, é que somos responsáveis, né, não só pelo atendimento dessas pessoas, mas pela modulação das despesas que são feitas hoje no nosso setor de medicina suplementar. Muito bem, a história dos hospitais, ela passa por aí, né? Então, vocês vejam aqui que um dos primeiros hospitais brasileiros foi exatamente a Santa Casa da Bahia. Eu estou dizendo que foi a Santa Casa da Bahia, na realidade, o primeiro hospital brasileiro foi a Santa Casa de Santos, né? Todo mundo sabe, e só que a Santa Casa de Santos não faz parte da ANAP, e a Santa Casa da Bahia faz. Então, eu cito a Santa Casa de Santos e coloco aqui a Santa Casa da Bahia, através do Hospital Santa Isabel, como uma das grandes instituições. Ou seja, desde o século XVI, nós temos instituições hospitalares no nosso país. É verdade que, se a gente comparar com países europeus, as nossas instituições elas são relativamente jovens, como jovens somos nós, mas de qualquer forma isso significa o que é que os hospitais eram no passado? Basicamente isso. Eram para registrar as doenças, para registrar as curas, quando elas existiam. Você tinha os chamados templos de Esculápio, na Grécia Antiga, em Roma você tinha aqueles que ofereciam, né, conselhos médicos, e na Europa, durante a Idade Média, que é exatamente esse período que eu estou citando para vocês, século XV, século XVI, os hospitais eram locais onde basicamente, você tinha uma ação religiosa, uma ação caritativa, e daí o nome hospital, né, que é um local para ter hospitalidade, e que naquela época significava o bem morrer. Então, na realidade, os hospitais eram locais onde as pessoas iam para morrer. Ainda são hoje, né? Mas, de qualquer forma, os hospitais também eles ajudam na extensão desse processo. Houve uma evolução desse processo, e aqui eu trouxe algumas imagens para vocês perceberem o porquê. Porque os hospitais passaram a ter uma significação importante. Em primeiro lugar, não prejudicar. Primum non nocere. É exatamente aquilo que os hospitais têm que fazer. Por isso que hoje, quando nós falamos de qualidade assistencial, quando falamos de segurança assistencial, nós estamos falando exatamente nisso, né? Nós não podemos ter instituições hospitalares que causem problemas a mais para os clientes. Ou seja, estou dizendo para vocês que sempre que se procurar uma instituição hospitalar, você tem que procurar uma instituição hospitalar que, em primeiro lugar, ela fornece para vocês qualidade, porque oferecer acesso sem qualidade é irresponsabilidade. Então, é importante que todos nós saibamos disso, e é importante que a gente tenha esse conceito muito importante, principalmente vocês que cuidam com vidas, e que são responsáveis, muitas vezes, pela manutenção de colegas de vocês. Há um acesso, e é um acesso principalmente com instituições que devam ser necessariamente instituições importantes. Eu gosto de mostrar essas figuras porque, primeiro, nós devemos o início de toda, digamos assim, toda a gestão hospitalar, como não podia deixar de ser, não foi médico que foi fazer gestão hospitalar, é óbvio, né? Os médicos não gostam dessa coisa chamada gestão, que acho que atrapalha o dia a dia deles, né? Mas quem realmente começou todo esse processo de gestão foi essa senhora aí, chamada Florence Nightingale, né? Uma enfermeira que, durante a guerra da Crimeia, começou exatamente a fazer a gestão de leitos naqueles hospitais de guerra. Começou a contar os números de feridos, contar os números de mortos, e através dela, que morreu no dia 12 de maio, que hoje, todos os anos, a gente faz a comemoração do Dia da Enfermagem. Todas as grandes instituições têm a sua comemoração em cima desse profissional, que é o profissional nuclear da assistência hospitalar dentro de qualquer instituição, porque são elas que, no dia a dia, é quem fazem a gestão do paciente acontecer. Essa outra figura é para mostrar para vocês como os hospitais foram evoluindo. Isso é um hospital que fica em Barcelona, está aqui, olha, o Hospital de La Santa Creu e São Paulo. E a grande importância disso é que ele trazia para dentro de si também parâmetros de gestão. Cada um desses prédios que vocês estão vendo aí era uma clínica, era um tipo de clínica, uma clínica cirúrgica, uma clínica médica, outra clínica obstétrica e assim sucessivamente. O prédio, no meio desses 8 prédios, lá atrás, era o centro cirúrgico, sempre interligado por túneis. Veja que interessante, porque em cima o que se tinha era plantação de laranja, era horta, porque já naquela época se achava que o homem, a mulher, no fundo, a saúde era um bem que para ser retratado, ele dependia muito de estar num ambiente sadio, com boa alimentação, com boa respiração, ou seja, tudo aquilo que hoje nós falamos de qualidade de vida, que nessa época já era colocado. E é óbvio que esse super edifício aqui na frente, né, tem essa forma de V invertido, virado para a gente. Vocês provavelmente já sabem o que era, porque também, desde aquela época, essas coisas aconteciam. Esse é o prédio da administração, né? Ou seja, era o maior de todos os prédios. E aí vamos nós. O que é que aconteceu com isso? Os hospitais evoluíram, assim como a saúde evoluiu. No fundo, a evolução da nossa instituição hospitalar, ela acontece da mesma forma que evoluiu a sociedade. Ou seja, com o tempo, e isso aqui já foi dito para vocês várias vezes, né, nós tivemos uma predominância das doenças crônicas, não transmissíveis, veja lá o vermelhinho, que são os tumores malignos, enquanto que todas aquelas doenças que são as doenças, né, mais infecciosas, elas tiveram um declínio. Consequentemente, os hospitais também tiveram que se adaptar a esse tipo de coisa. O que aconteceu? Nós resolvemos, e hoje ainda estamos nessa fase, cuidar dos pacientes com excelência, através exatamente destas questões que estamos aqui. Ou seja, eficiência na execução. Os hospitais, eles buscam, através principalmente da sua governança corporativa, buscar eficiência na sua gestão, porque a governança clínica, no fundo, o que ela busca é a eficácia. Nós buscamos a chamada segurança assistencial, a qualidade na prestação do serviço, isso eu já reiterei para vocês, vou reiterar várias vezes durante a fala, a satisfação do médico, a resolutividade da assistência e a contenção de custos. Esse é o papel do hospital antigo. Eu sempre me pergunto, o que está fazendo a satisfação dos médicos aí? Você já deve ter ido em algum hospital, que de vez em quando eu falo, olha, nós aqui temos 4 clientes ou 5 clientes, não importa, né? Primeiro é o paciente, depois é o acompanhante, depois é a fonte pagadora, depois é o médico, não necessariamente nessa ordem. Eu queria dar uma notícia para vocês, que o hospital só tem um cliente, que se chama paciente. Você não faz sentido você construir um hospital, montar um hospital para atender aos médicos, nem aos fornecedores, nem quem quer que seja, muito menos os visitantes. Hospital, uma instituição como essa, é feita exclusivamente para atender os seus clientes principais, que são os pacientes. Então, isso é uma coisa importante que a gente também tem que ter. Isso aqui já foi colocado porque, na realidade, como eu disse para vocês, que a sociedade fez as instituições hospitalares mudando. Aquele desenho, ele começa a ser impactado, né? Exatamente por essas coisas que a gente já colocou. Essa pirâmide etária, essa mudança, ela está fazendo com que aquele desenho de solidariedade intergeracional que nós tínhamos, onde os jovens, eles sustentam os idosos, né? Através das suas contribuições, através do seu trabalho, onde aqueles que são menos doentes cuidam daqueles que são mais doentes, mas na realidade esse processo está mudando. Hoje nós temos 24 milhões de pessoas acima dos 60 anos de idade, alguns de nós eu acho que já se inclui aqui, já fazemos parte desse processo, né? E vejam aqui, ó, daqui em 2030, nós vamos ter praticamente 20% da nossa população idosa, precisando de assistência médica, de assistência à saúde, precisando de atendimento, precisando de lazer, precisando de alimento, precisando de transporte, uma série de coisas. E vejam que isso significa, nós estamos em 17, significa 13 anos. Eu não sei se às vezes a gente tem em mente o que são 13 anos. O Brasil ganhou a sua última Copa do Mundo em 2002, há 16 anos, há 15 anos. Ou seja, está mais perto a gente ter 20% da nossa população acima de 60 anos do que o tempo que a gente ganhou a última Copa do Mundo. Eu espero que a gente ganhe o ano que vem. E aí muda tudo isso aqui que eu estou fazendo, eu vou ter que mudar o discurso. Mas vejam como isso será rápido, como isso vai ser importante. Somado com isso, aquilo que já foi falado para vocês, a chamada tripla carga, né? Nós continuamos, como vocês viram, com as doenças, nós temos as doenças crônicas, a principal causa de morte no nosso país hoje são as doenças cardíacas e vasculares, vocês sabem disso, depois as doenças oncológicas, depois as doenças neurológicas, e também convivemos ainda com as chamadas doenças infecciosas. Quem não ouviu falar de Zika? Quem não ouviu falar de todas essas febre amarela? Ou seja, nós continuamos com toda essa ação e mais do que isso, vivemos hoje, infelizmente, numa sociedade absolutamente traumática. Nós vivemos numa sociedade onde tivemos o ano passado 50 mil pessoas que tiveram acidentes e que foram feridas ou que morreram. Esse número é absurdo. Né? Quando você compara com qualquer país, eu não sei quanto que é na Holanda, mas eu me lembro que o ano retrasado, quando teve a Copa do Mundo, eu fui ver uma apresentação do ministro da Saúde da Suécia, e ele falou assim, ele pediu desculpa ao apresentar que eles, no ano passado, no ano anterior, tinham tido 260 mortos, né, no trânsito. E a gente falou, pô, só? Né, nós tivemos 50 mil. Então, vejam como nós temos problemas. E isso evidentemente, somado a todos os problemas de violência social, que eu não preciso ficar aqui descrevendo para todos nós, porque nós estamos, dia a dia, nós somos agredidos com essas informações e com essa imagem. Isso gera o quê? Uma situação incontrolável, inclusive do seu ponto de vista de estilo de vida. Nós esquecemos de cuidar do nosso estilo de vida, né? Exercício físico, alimentação, já foi dito, forma de se ver, ou seja, aquilo que nós temos que fazer, somado tudo, nós estamos aí com uma bomba relógio muito parecida com a bomba relógio da Previdência. A Previdência, vocês sabem que é uma bomba relógio, porque enquanto esses países europeus, que estão todos aqui nos brindando hoje com essas informações, primeiro enriqueceram e depois envelheceram, nós, infelizmente, estamos envelhecendo sem enriquecer. E há mais um impulso para a mudança que vocês viram, que é a chamada tecnologia. E aqui eu estou me referindo mesmo à tecnologia médica, eu não estou me referindo às TICs, a tecnologia de informação e comunicação, que são fundamentais, o Nick já colocou, que são exatamente os apps, todo o processo de comunicação que a gente tem hoje, que leva o hospital para dentro das casas das pessoas, traz as pessoas para dentro do hospital, e eu vou falar isso muito rapidamente. Mas isso daqui vocês vejam, afinal das contas, isso daqui aumenta os custos do setor de saúde? É óbvio que aumenta. Se você pede muito mais do que deve, se você, ao invés de usar, porque a tecnologia ela é importante, a tecnologia ela é fundamental, porque afinal das contas ela dá melhor qualidade de vida, a nossa longevidade também é baseada nela. De qualquer forma, ela aumenta o custo. Então vocês vejam, o mesmo tipo aqui de exame, né, através dos tempos até essa tecnologia. A primeira imagem radiológica do mundo foi feita pelo Röntgen, um alemão que fez como não era, desde aquela época, né? Imagino que ele, como bom homem, ele era cuidadoso, o primeiro raio-x que ele fez foi da mão da mulher dele, né? Exatamente com a aliança de casado aqui, para não ter problema. O que vai acontecer com os hospitais? O futuro, o cenário futuro, assistência realizada em casa, através de telemedicina e telemonitoramento. Os hospitais vão entrar nas nossas casas. Os hospitais vão servir apenas para casos agudos. Não faz sentido. Nós, os hospitais, recebemos aqueles casos que não são agudos, muito menos ficar com pacientes crônicos dentro do hospital. No âmbito dos hospitais da ANAP, 1% dos nossos pacientes são pacientes de longa permanência. Isso significa 2.800 internações por ano. Longa permanência é qualquer internação acima de 90 dias, ou seja, esse é um processo longo. Os hospitais vão ter um máximo de escolha dos pacientes. Os pacientes é que vão escolher as instituições. E nós vamos ter vários empreendedores cuidando das instituições. Os hospitais vão ser hubs de assistência, porque é importante que os hospitais eles estejam no centro, porque é aqui que tem a tecnologia. Como eles só vão atender esses casos, toda a rede integrada, toda a rede de assistência tem que estar ligada no hospital para que ele possa fornecer tecnologia, desenvolvimento e uma série de coisas que a gente pode fornecer. Cuidado, e os hospitais ainda vão ter que cuidar do cidadão, o quê? Com excelência. Através do quê? Instituições de alta confiabilidade. Isso é fundamental. Os hospitais têm que ser altamente confiáveis. Trabalham através do quê? Do trabalho em time, já foi colocado, com equipes de alta performance, né? A existência de uma gestão médico-assistencial, os médicos e os outros profissionais de saúde vão ter que entrar dentro da gestão, uma governança organizacional, que isso aqui todos vocês conhecem, então não vou repetir, uma centralidade no cuidado do paciente, instituição baseada em valor, já foi colocado, né? o Value-Based Healthcare, ou seja, nós temos que trabalhar em cima disso, estamos trabalhando, nós temos um projeto hoje onde a gente está implantando os sets, os standard sets, exatamente para chegarmos a essa necessidade. Segurança do paciente como credo, segurança é a principal coisa que a gente tem obrigação a dar para os nossos clientes, qualidade e segurança. E eficiência no combate ao desperdício, que aqui vou ter que falar muito rapidinho. O último estudo da OCDE mostra que algo em torno de 20% de tudo aquilo que é gasto em saúde é desperdício. E eu não estou falando de corrupção. Corrupção é 10% disso. Ou seja, o Brasil, ano passado, gastou 500 bilhões de reais. Com saúde, sempre falando em grandes números. 100 bilhões foram desperdício. 10 bilhões, consequentemente, 10% disso, corrupção, as mais variadas, né? Os profissionais médicos que colocam próteses que são desnecessárias, que recebem comissão, que nos envergonha a todos. Instituições médicas onde muitas vezes estão envolvidas, hospitais envolvidos nessas traquinagens, que também é algo que todos nós temos que nos envergonhar e temos que combater através de compliance, através de denúncia, através de modelos éticos. Ou seja, todas essas corrupções que são feitas a nível dos grandes governos, que compram aquilo que não deve ou pedem comissão para comprar aquelas coisas que são, às vezes, necessárias, mas muitas vezes desnecessárias, e tudo aquilo que é desperdício é aquilo que não se precisa. É o paciente que fica mais tempo internado do que deve, é o médico que não sabe fazer a prescrição correta e prescreve para o medicamento errado, ele tem que ser trocado, é o médico que pede o exame errado, é o profissional de enfermagem que não cuida, não faz a gestão do paciente adequado. Tudo isso desperdício, e é exatamente isso que nós temos que resgatar no nosso país. Últimas mensagens chaves aqui para vocês. Triplo desafio dos hospitais. Aumento das necessidades. A população vai querer cada vez mais saúde, ela vai querer mais estar ligada às instituições. Restrição de recursos, é óbvio, né? Os recursos na área de saúde eles não são infindáveis, vai sempre ter. E mudança dos valores sociais. Da mesma forma que muda no nosso país, né, uma série de conceituações do ponto de vista de sexualidade, do ponto de vista de civilidade, do ponto de vista de convicções políticas, também essas mudanças todas mudam aquilo que as instituições de saúde, principalmente, que são grandes anteparos daquilo que acontece na sociedade, vão ter que mudar. Os hospitais vão ser menores. O hospital grande, muitas vezes, ele é ineficiente. Os hospitais, como eu disse para vocês, que ele vai ficar mais para casos agudos, eles vão ter que ser menores, porém vão ter que ser mais complexos através disso. O foco vai ser em serviços de alto valor, mas não necessariamente de alto volume, porque a gente espera que eles não precisem chegar aos hospitais. Os desfechos clínicos, como componentes do pagamento, vocês devem cobrar dos hospitais, sim, a chamada performance, os resultados clínicos, e se for preciso, nós estamos disponíveis para ajudar vocês a fazer esses desenhos desses estandes, para que todos nós façamos esse tipo de coisa, né? E mudança dos valores sociais. Novos serviços, né? Já foi dito aqui, quer dizer, com essa mudança toda, os hospitais vão ser especializados, vamos trabalhar com genômica, vamos trabalhar com medicina personalizada. Nós vamos ter os hospitais, eu já disse lá quando eu falei do Hub and Spoke, que nós vamos ser coordenadores de redes assistenciais e gestão dos cuidados dos pacientes crônicos. Aonde? Dentro do hospital? Não, fora, na sua casa, em outro tipo de instituição, mas nunca dentro dos hospitais. Porque o custo do hospital não é para isso, né? As instituições não podem ficar. A média de permanência no hospital tem que ser cada vez menor. Então, essa tecnologia toda, ela tem que se pagar e não é correto que uma instituição que se prepara para ser uma instituição de alta complexidade fique com pacientes que não sejam. Dupla função, terciária, que é aquilo que eu disse, e ao mesmo tempo para aquelas pessoas que estão ao redor, aquela comunidade que vive ao redor, essas instituições elas vão ter um apelo territorial. O cara que mora ali do lado do Sírio-Libanês, ele quer ser atendido ali. O cara que mora... Como eu sou presidente da ANAP, preciso falar dos dois. O cara que mora perto do Einstein, ele quer ser atendido ali. Ele não quer ser atendido em outro lugar. Então, só que, ao mesmo tempo, essas instituições elas são referências nacionais, referências internacionais. Então, essa é a questão. O papel do hospital também tem que se adaptar a esse tipo de situação. Vamos trabalhar, e ele já falou, no redesenho de serviço. Os hospitais têm um conhecimento clínico acumulado enorme. Se nós não utilizarmos isso, que é a nossa grande riqueza, né? E ele falou já do design thinking, não vai fazer sentido tudo aquilo que nós fizemos esses anos todos, né? Hospitais abertos, os hospitais sem parede, hospitais abertos, as pessoas vão nos hospitais através das suas casas e o hospital vai e entra na casa das pessoas. Será assim? Assim é que as instituições elas vão ter, e nós vamos romper exatamente as fronteiras dos departamentos. Eu quero ir na urologia, eu quero ir na radiologia, não vai existir mais isso. Tá? Vão ser processos assistenciais que todo mundo vai ter que entrar, porque os novos modelos de remuneração, que são baseados principalmente em bundles, levando em consideração o Value-Based Healthcare, não leva em consideração exatamente um procedimento, mas ele leva em consideração um processo de assistência. Centro de inovação de tecnologia e serviços, hospitais são locais, pesquisa e educação como resultado-chave, né? Os hospitais são centros educacionais, né? Modelos de comportamento, isso aqui é importante para vocês. Não vai existir instituição e vocês podem cobrar. Os hospitais, os prestadores de serviços têm que compartilhar risco com quem paga. E quem paga tem que exigir isso. Eu pago, eu exijo que você se comporte desta ou desta forma. Portanto, não é uma coisa de briga, né? Vou dar uma porrada em você se você não fizer isso que eu quero. Não é isso. É trabalhar juntos, porque no fundo, posso ser sincero com vocês? Quem tem o dinheiro é quem define aquilo que é feito. Então, logo, é importante que esse risco ele seja exatamente compartilhado entre prestadores de serviço e operadores de plano de saúde ou fontes, né, de participação. Participação ativa de profissionais hospitalares na governança, que é bacana, todo mundo vai se envolver com a gestão. Uma atenção integrada e equipes orientadas para processos, isso eu já falei para vocês, não vai ser mais em procedimento, vai ser mais em casa, em processo. O hospital ele é absolutamente conectado, né? Através de apps, através de computação, aquilo que vocês quiserem, super conectado, como nós somos hoje, né? Novos papéis profissionais, nós vamos ter novos profissionais dentro dos hospitais, né? Aqui, coach de saúde, conselheiros genéticos, engenheiro, aqui, o Nick é um engenheiro médico, ou um médico engenheiro, não sei, ele, né? Equipes multiprofissionais orientadas para processos. E a última, inovação centrada no paciente. Tudo que nós temos que fazer só pode ter um único sentido, só pode ter uma única pessoa, uma única fonte de inspiração para nós, o paciente. Gente, muito obrigado, fico à disposição de vocês.
Muito obrigado, Balestrinho. Vamos ouvir Karina Ilders. Vai falar sobre o liderança médica hoje e amanhã. Karine.
First of all, I want to thank the organization for inviting me here in this lovely place, where the Dutch water management is nothing compared to what I've seen here. In the coming minutes, I will lead you through the different aspects of medical leadership, giving insights in the practice of the oldest hospital of the Netherlands, the Reinier de Graaf Hospital, as a gynecologist and medical director, but also as a professor on the chair of medical management and leadership at the Erasmus University in Rotterdam. Leadership has evolved over history, where different leaders have played their role in specific ways. As we now look at the concept of leadership, much scientific research, different theories and concepts have been elucidated. Overall, leadership has been used both discursively as well as strategically, as it always resembles as a result of its time. Worldwide, there appears to be a growing relevance for the position of the medical professional in public organizations such as hospitals. Also in the Netherlands, much attention in the recent decades has been given to the changes in healthcare and the participation of healthcare professionals, particularly medical specialists. The reason for this joint accountability is the growing knowledge and experience that the complexity and scale of the challenges in healthcare are so huge that these cannot be resolved solely by the government or solely by market forces. It requires a common ground where the pursuit of the creation of value will have a central role. That is why we need medical leadership. Leadership in which the role of the medical professional is essential in connecting different views within healthcare, catalyzing and playing an active role in this process. This is medical leadership, connecting the medical domain with the managerial domain by transparency, communication, and mutual understanding, with the aim of improving patient care on a day-to-day basis. We all know that we are confronted almost daily with the challenge of rising costs in healthcare due to new drugs, new technologies, healthy aging with multimorbidity, and the patient wanting more and better treatments. By addressing these rising costs, we are confronted with silos in healthcare organizations, which makes it very difficult to address this problem as a common responsibility due to the perseverance of fragmentation. The need for control in quality and safety is felt on a day-to-day basis by an endless stream of performance indicators, the pressure of notification of safety, the safe incident reporting by the ward, and achieving a minimum number of emergencies per year per hospital. In addition, these measurement systems have to be transparent for holding accountable as an overall social responsibility. When looking at the demand of healthcare, it will be largely determined by older, multimorbid or chronic patients. This requires a more generalistic approach in addition to increasing specializations that is driven by technology and innovation. Taking the economic as well as the medical challenges into account, we are in need for a paradigm shift in which we need to focus increasingly on operational excellence in performance on the basis of value creation for the patient. Healthcare professionals will assume more of a coaching role where shared decision-making supports to what is really important for the patient in his or her life. Moreover, the responsibility of the patient itself must be encouraged for taking responsibility for their own health, which should lead to a dynamic balance between healthcare support and self-regulation. In summary, the healthcare landscape will evolve from a disease management to a health management due to the aging population, more chronic disease, rising costs, and a more holistic concept. In this transition, we will increasingly focus on the 4 Ps: personalized healthcare, preventive healthcare, predictive healthcare, and participative healthcare. This transition will be enabled by different tools like technology support systems, genetic counseling, pharma biotechnology, medical technology, and consumer market developments. But how do we manage all these changes in healthcare? To accomplish this, we have to shift from a more control system to an adaptive system. We have to adjust healthcare more and more in view of the social, physical, and emotional challenges in life and use innovations to align these needs. Although it seems very challenging in respect to change management and getting things done, to focus more on the magical, inspiring elements, in a complex organization as a hospital, it is of extreme importance to, on one hand, introduce flexibility in the system, but on the other hand, to stay in control by delivering excellent, good quality of healthcare. So to manage all the essential changes in healthcare, it demands, on one hand, to maintain control of what is required by incremental innovations, such as lean management or integrated care, whereby the existing healthcare process is optimized. On the other hand, this requires radical innovations where new healthcare solutions are used to connect the new developments, like, for example, the Watson Decision Aid. As healthcare becomes more and more complex, and there is more need for integrated and thematic healthcare, a cohesive organization with a clear vision and business philosophy focused on the future demands for healthcare will be very necessary. In the Reinier de Graaf Hospital, we therefore focus on different modalities to answer these challenges by integrating the lean philosophy in the organization, leading to a more integrated and transparent quality and safety environment, creating value not only for the patient, but also for our employees, resulting in an organization managed by so-called responsible autonomy. It has already been shown that organizations which focus on operational excellence and everyday learning will perform much better by outrunning the field. These leaders have incorporated continuous improvement in their daily work. This daily improvement will result in a continuous improvement of quality of care, but also getting everyone involved. In a time where external pressure in healthcare increases, it becomes more and more important to get everyone involved, enthusiastic, and contributing to the focus of the organization. This continuous focus on quality improvement outreaches the results compared to improvement only on project basis, or even worse, only when something really went wrong. By focusing on the input in the organization as if it were a routine behavior, It will naturally lead to better outcomes and results. In this respect, it is very important to measure the objectives and having feedback on the continuous cycle of improvement. It will also encourage people on the working floor, being aware of excellent, concrete results by just doing. By introducing a responsibility for continuous improvement for every team member by just doing and not first asking, it will have its effect on personal growth, commitment, and responsible autonomy. This so-called lean leadership will evolve in the organization as long as it has its continuous support from the board of directors. A prerequisite for establishing a lean organization is the commitment and support of the board of directors. It even has to have a central role in the development of the strategy for the organization. By taking feedback of the employees on the vision into account, it will lead to the common purpose. By analyzing improvements and setting a challenging goal, it will support the development and implementation of the strategy of the organization. From the lean method in practice, we encounter lots of daily challenges in the hospital with capacity management. In measuring results and working to continuous improvement, it still is not solved, where at sometimes there are more patients arriving in the hospital than there are beds available. Before the time we were analyzing this on the basis of the lean principle, there was a lot of agitation. As a fellow medical specialist said, and it's also described in the book Advanced Lean and Healthcare Management, From Hockey to Ballet, working in a consulting room is like playing an ice hockey game. From the moment the puck is in the game, there's chaos, whereas when the final signal sounds, there appears peace and quietness again. The challenge in an organization as a hospital starts with the optimization of these processes in the workplace. In healthcare, we have the so-called clinical variation, operational variation, and the demand variation. It is this kind of variation we have to control more by analyzing the variation and adjust the different processes to it, so making it more predictable and handle variation. The philosophy of continuous improvement will not only have its effect on operational excellence, but also on how we focus on quality and safety. It will lead to a responsible, almost curious attitude in which a safe environment is a prerequisite. To support this learning environment, the professionals have to get used to transparency, sharing results, but also being open for feedback and sharing what went wrong. In this process, it is of utmost importance to professionally train them in how to address quality and safety issues, to conduct certain procedures and learn from analysis. In this quality and safety process, it always is a challenge to run through the right procedure and not jumping into conclusions right away. It has to be a safe environment when striving for transparency. In this respect, an important step in the process is the Plan, Do, Check, Act cycle, in which improvements have to be implemented on the working floor. This is, in general, is the most difficult part, in which in practice we have to change and improve. Involvement of the medical professionals is an absolute requirement to succeed in quality improvement. It is useful to realize that in quality and safety implementation in the organization, there are different stages, from only the collection of data, to summarize or even analyzing the data, to eventually increase knowledge in how to improve quality and even better, to set it into action. It is of utmost importance to know and to realize in which stage your organization is. This because you have to set realistic goals in an environment in which safety is guaranteed and the professional has to experience support. If quality is not a real issue in the organization, we call it the pathological stage. When there is increasing trust or accountability, the organization can shift in a reactive or calculative phase. What we eventually aim for is the phase in which everyone is accountable, well-informed and proactive in a safe and highly reliable organization. When addressing these continuous improvement modalities, value-based healthcare, as a very used term nowadays, is complementary. The essence of value-based healthcare, looking at the value creation at the end of the care cycle, will profit from integrating the lean practice during the process. The short cycle improvements will eventually lead to better outcome. In addition, the outcome in which not only the patient's outcome counts, but also the satisfaction of the professional. This will become more and more important in the near future, where the working force in healthcare will be limited. As we can conclude from the previous slides, adopting the lean philosophy in the organization eventually and even naturally leads to improvement, not only in operational excellence, but also in quality and safety, value-based healthcare, and a transparent, responsible culture in which the value of the patient is the core issue and the only interest to be considered. To also address this interest in the direct contact with the patient in the consulting room, the need for shared decision-making has made this convincing evidence. Patients exposed to decision aids are more knowledgeable, better informed, and clearer about their values compared to usual care. This is consistent across a variety of decision-making contexts, as reported in over 100 empirical studies. Although healthcare professionals often report that they are already applying shared decision-making, scientific research indicates that there is considerable room for improvement on endorsing partnership, supporting deliberation, and making the choice to really implement shared decision-making in daily practice. In the Netherlands, a national program just started in which hospitals can participate in an implementation program aiming at the application of shared decision-making. What we already know from these results is that a so-called timeout for the patient after receiving their diagnosis is very important. To have the opportunity to discuss the situation with their partner, relatives, or even doctor would result in more patient satisfaction, more secure about their choice or treatment, and less regret. In the Reinier de Graaf Hospital, we perform action learning research in which the barriers and facilitators give insight in how the professionals experience working on applying shared decision-making and time-out procedures within the support of a tailor-made implementation program. What do all these requirements for improvement to healthcare in the future mean for the medical profession? I figured that a more critical perspective in this concept was needed. When taking a closer look to the descriptions of medical leadership and what medical leaders are assumed to do, it occurs to me that a lot of these changes in healthcare and a new role for the medical professional are challenging descriptions of the good professional. And it might not have to do so much with the classical perspective of a leader who is clearly distinctive of others. This assumes that what once the standard was for being a good professional is apparently not good enough anymore. There's an increasing pressure on the role of the professional due to several external influences. Here to mention the introduction of management in healthcare systems, the involvement in information exchange and transparency, and the medical constitution of most of the patients nowadays being more complex and multimorbidity having its needs for integrated care. In addition to the mentioned external influences on the medical profession, there was also the vision in the late 20th century that the professionals were in need for so-called management. Due to the conviction of the healthcare system being in need for more structure on cost and processes, management was introduced in the late 20th century, the so-called new public management. This was a reaction to the establishment of large organizations and rising costs. These external demands are all examples which could lead to reactive actions which are mainly carried out in order to restore disruptive professional arrangements, or to active involvement of medical professionals themselves in changing medical professionalism and thereby taking responsibility. The development and promotion of medical leadership shows how advocates of medical leadership explicitly encourage medical professionals to proactively change their attitude, practices, education, and field. In many Dutch healthcare organizations, there's a dual governance model where the board and the medical staff of the hospital share joint responsibility. In 1987, Mintzberg already told us that a healthcare organization contains an inverted power structure in which people at the bottom generally have greater influence over decision-making on a day-to-day basis than those who are nominally in control at the top. In these disconnected hierarchies, organizational leaders have to negotiate rather than impose new policies and practices. That means that healthcare organizations are professional bureaucracies where the informal power lies within the medical professionals. This means that changes can only be achieved by making professionals share responsibility for the intended goal. This means that there is a growing relevance for the position of the medical professional in an organization such as a hospital. Physicians can take over the knowledge of managers, not the other way around. So this unique position has to be consolidated in the organization in which they are in the lead, and it comes to integration of responsibility as well the medical part as well as the managerial part. In order to maintain the quality of high standard, accessibility and efficiency in our healthcare system, there is need for leadership to ensure that the connection is made between, on one hand, the management domain in which regulation of systems, transparency and control dominates the process, and on the other hand, the medical domain, where patients' ethics or response to therapy or whether treatment is desired, makes this domain considerably more flexible. It is this connection between these two domains through transparency, communication, and mutual understanding that is the essence of medical leadership. It is the medical professional who will have to balance the managerial and the clinical mindset in order to align the various changes and challenges in healthcare in future. Medical leadership is therefore not one type of leadership, but is a stratification that reflects the different roles and positions that healthcare professionals hold within the healthcare system. In the hospital setting, medical leadership will be characterized by themes such as shared decision-making, transparency in quality and safety, multidisciplinary care, operational excellence, which should lead to an improvement in patient care on a day-to-day basis. This clinical leadership means an active involvement and responsibility for improvement of healthcare every day, not only by clinical practice, but also by performing research and education. Depending on the position of a medical professional in the organization, clinical leadership can increasingly be combined with management. In the role of medical manager, staff president, or the director of medical affairs, the professional will increasingly be assigned with management tasks and responsibilities that are integrated into medical practice. It will be the medical professional who will have to bring the nuances of the workplace into the boardroom in order to achieve mutual improvements and insights in performance. Leadership will emerge through different new roles to ascertain the improvements in a complex healthcare system by a social process in which it is about influencing and motivating others to achieve a common goal, shortly stated as leading by example. Apart from more intrinsic leadership roles like commitment, respect, energy, or courage, to lead this change in a setting like a hospital, some critical behaviors for change have to be mentioned. That is person-centeredness, frontline engagement, relentless focus, transparency, and no traditional boundaries. In the Netherlands, much attention has been given to the changes in healthcare and the participation of healthcare professionals, particularly medical specialists. The idea behind this was based on the integration of medical specialists in the hospital organization and making them more accountable with the goal of reducing costs and providing efficient and highly qualitative healthcare. A vehicle for this was the introduction of the integral rates. Also on a national level, by introducing a vision document, the active and participation, responsibility and even a leading role has been attributed to the medical specialists. In this document, they state 4 items being important for the role of the medical specialist in the future healthcare in the Netherlands. In their ambition, they state that in 2025, Dutch specialized medical care will have proven itself to be among the most innovative, efficient and high quality in the world. Dutch healthcare, just like Dutch water management, will serve as an international example from which patients and medical specialists all over the world benefit. The first issue is stated as the unique patient. The second is towards network medicine. The third one has an involvement in health and behavior. And the fourth one includes the role of medical specialists in innovations. Besides this awareness of the professional, of his or her different roles and responsibilities in the healthcare system, the training of professionals in medical leadership will need to take concrete forms. Research has shown that there is an increased desire among healthcare professionals to develop effective leadership, knowledge of management, and trust in professional and personal skills. To facilitate this ambition, you have to support medical ambition in your organization by attendance at fixed and formal and informal meetings, introduce MD programs, and engage the professional with strategic planning and development. What's important in the starting is that it starts at different levels in the organization with also different people in the organization. That means not only with the medical specialists, but also nurses and mixed training programs with managers. If we view the complexity of healthcare as a challenge and are not bogged down in the role of victim, but instead think about what we can contribute, this perpetuates the leading role of medical professionalism in healthcare. By doing so, we have to focus on a common purpose that is good patient outcome, improved efficiency, excellent reputation, and last but not least, a greater cause. After all, it is the patient who will determine the substance of healthcare in the future and who will be in charge of this. This is evident in issues such as shared decision-making, end-of-life care, healthy living and behavior, vitality and well-being. It has become time that we no longer hide behind this complexity of healthcare and the patients, but take responsibility to resolve the pressure on the system. It endorses the necessity and need for new leadership, medical leadership, where the medical professional will have to act as a connector between the patient and the complex environment. Medical leadership is the affirmation of the role of the patient. Thank you.
Obrigado, Karina. Eu já queria começar perguntando ao Nick o seguinte. Você deixou claro que a população vai viver mais. E isso vai criar problemas, aí, porque a vida, as condições de vida deles não vão acompanhar esse processo de envelhecimento. Isso é impossível, quer dizer, a medicina não vai avançar suficientemente para que as pessoas vivam bem com mais idade. Isso já é decidido. Não vai dar. É isso?
Well, thank you very much for the question. Obviously, we have this progress in medicine, and it will improve lives, etc. Although I think what we see in general in medical innovation, it takes elements, aspects of our health, rather than improve health in a very general way in the community. So yes, we have improvements in individual for a great deal, and the innovations over the last 50 years showed the power of innovation in medicine. Although the drawback, what we see now, is that it's come at a cost. We see it in pharmaceutical interventions. We see it in all other type of technologies as diagnostics, and the very big gains in health are decreasing. So what we see is that we see a lot of interesting innovations, but the improvements in health in general is only marginal at the population level. And then it comes to making decisions. Okay, how can we improve general well-being, social situation of people in general, rather than we focusing only on very small groups and on marginal improvements. That doesn't rule out that maybe in some technology might develop who can improve everything. But if we're looking back to the evidence till today, we have to carefully decide where to invest in.
Balestrin, eu queria saber se o Hospital do Futuro já existe ou quanto tempo vai demorar para que tenhamos o que você qualificou de Hospital do Futuro.
Na realidade, isso tudo é um processo. Você tem instituições em diferentes fases daquelas que foram colocadas. Então, como toda a mudança social, ela não acontece de uma hora para outra. Você simplesmente não sai de uma fase e vai para outra. Ela é sempre incremental, ela é sempre um processo. Então, você tem sim instituições que já têm algumas dessas, vamos chamar assim, de habilidades novas já implantadas. Eu mesmo tive a oportunidade de visitar o Hospital da Carina, várias daquelas coisas você já tem implantado lá, como várias outras instituições nossas aqui, que eu inclusive citei, que fazem parte da ANAP. Então, esse processo, ele acontece sim. Se você me perguntar quanto tempo que ele vai demorar, eu diria para você que ele vai demorar o quanto a sociedade, de alguma forma, exigir que ele aconteça. Porque, na realidade, em países que estão mais desenvolvidos, isso já acontece porque existe uma homogeneidade maior. Em países como o nosso, onde nós temos desde o pequeno hospital de 30 leitos, uma cidade muito longínqua, até grandes instituições hospitalares que são absolutamente conectadas com aquilo que acontece em qualquer lugar do mundo, esse processo ele é mais demorado. Então, mas isso vai acontecer, porque cedo ou tarde ele tem que acontecer. E quem não acompanhar, vai fechar. Nos últimos 5 anos, nós tivemos 256 hospitais fechados no nosso país, 1 por semana. Exatamente porque não acompanharam, digamos, aquilo que hoje se espera dos hospitais, ainda estavam no passado. No futuro, vários deles também não chegarão. Então, nós vamos ter consolidações, nós temos vários hospitais que serão fechados, até porque, socialmente, o papel deles vai mudar.
Carina, a figura do líder, ela existe, o líder ele já nasce com essas características de liderança ou é possível formar um líder nessa área em que você trabalha?
Well, I think everyone is a leader, and we need everyone in healthcare to attribute to the organization. So the main part of medical leadership is personal leadership. So what your talents are, your energy, your willingness to attribute to a greater goal. And apart from that, there are programs in which you can teach more skills to the persons if they need them. So if the person is growing in more managerial roles, it's very needed to, as an organization, to support this by education, by training programs, by giving them the courage and, well, the performance for being a clinical leader, but also managerial roles. And also by bridging those two domains, that's very important.
Balestrin, a pergunta é do Gilson Paiva, Volvo do Brasil Veículos Limitada. Diz ele, concordo absolutamente que muitas doenças que são tratadas em hospitais devem ser transferidas para o ambiente doméstico. Mas falta estrutura nas residências, né? Aspectos físicos e até mesmo sociais. Cuidador, por exemplo. Pergunta, como e em quanto tempo teremos um cenário adequado para tal, também ponderando que o nosso país é de dimensões continentais?
Eu posso falar idem para a primeira resposta? Bem, existe um aspecto que a gente precisa ter muito em mente. A gente só produz mudanças, principalmente em saúde, quando nós temos algumas coisas para mudar. A primeira coisa é ter perfeitamente claro que o objeto de tudo aquilo que nós fazemos tem a ver com o nosso cliente, que, em última análise, é o paciente. Esse cidadão, ele precisa ser atendido porque ele tem objetividades de atenção, seja fora de casa, seja dentro de uma instituição. E essas questões, elas são, digamos assim, elas são estruturadas por 4 grandes ações. Primeiro, o modelo assistencial. Porque se nós não tivermos um modelo assistencial que privilegie exatamente um modelo de atenção, que seja um modelo de atenção de saúde, e seja exclusivamente um modelo de atenção que vise a doença, fica difícil, né? Acho que a maior parte de vocês já conhece o desenho. O que é saúde? Saúde é uma coisa horizontalizada. É o famoso 2 P's, 2 R's, né? Promoção, prevenção, recuperação e reabilitação. Você só consegue ver saúde se você fizer desta forma. Quando a gente fala de atendimento em casa, nós muitas vezes estamos nos referindo àquilo que tem a ver com a recuperação do paciente. Então, para que você tenha esse modelo, você precisa, junto com esse novo modelo assistencial, ter um modelo organizacional, e foi colocado várias vezes a organização do sistema. Você precisa ter também um modelo de gestão perfeitamente claro. O nosso modelo de gestão é absolutamente fragmentado. E, por último, um modelo de sustentação econômica e financeira disso, que todos nós já acordamos entre nós, que nós temos que mudar o nosso modelo de remuneração. Nosso modelo de remuneração hoje, que é o famoso fee for service para contas abertas, é mais ou menos como você pagar bombeiro para apagar incêndio. Todas as vezes que ele paga um incêndio, ele ganha o dinheiro. Se não apagar incêndio, ele não ganha dinheiro. Logo, o que ele vai fazer é tocar fogo nas casas mesmo, né? Para quê? Porque ele precisa pagar alguma coisa. O nosso modelo, ele privilegia isso, né? Então, quando você fala em assistência domiciliar, você tem toda a razão. Para que ela possa acontecer, nós temos todo esse caminho para andar. Porque hoje, da forma como nós fazemos, é toda fragmentada. O cidadão está no hospital, e aí vamos para que seja mais barato, vamos mandar para o home care. Mas não é porque seja mais barato, é porque isso faz parte de um processo de assistência à saúde, não à doença, que tem a ver com todo um processo de atenção ao cliente. É isso. Então, eu concordo que isso precisa ser feito. De novo, é difícil a gente estimar, porque no fundo, essa percepção, ela é uma percepção social, e o cidadão brasileiro clama por saúde, é o primeiro item de queixa do cidadão brasileiro, vocês viram, e infelizmente é o primeiro item que os nossos governantes, quando ganham, esquecem.
Agora eu vou fazer a penúltima pergunta para o Nick e depois a Karina vai encerrar. Nick, você enfatizou a necessidade do tratamento preventivo. Outros expositores também bateram nessa mesma tecla, se é preciso o tratamento preventivo. O que fazer para que essa prioridade seja atendida com a devida urgência?
Well, I think there, if you look into prevention, you have, I think, different perspectives. You have, well, more in general, public health at the society level, and there you see, for example, that education, good education is a very strong health predictor in life. It's very general. Most people don't think about education as a health intervention, but so it can be at a high level quite general. On the other hand, we have to think about at the individual. And for example, if we have prevention, lifestyle, it's much about behavior, about knowledge, and we have to address this at individual level. And then we are talking like things as enough exercise, a healthy diet, and a good social network and context. These are also 3 very strong predictors at the individual level to maintain healthy or to avoid complication if you're having a disease. So here comes also the technology in, where technology can help maybe to empower individuals or relatives close to this person in order to take more care of each other, strengthening social interaction and providing information which can help a person to have a better life. So I think we have many ingredients already there in our system. It's only for policymakers, for hospital directors, typical people like here in the room, where we have some sort of control in the society to change these things. So what we have to share a shared vision and making a plan of action, how we can stepwise change this and make this a change for people.
Karina, você encerra o debate respondendo a seguinte pergunta. Você também enfatizou o problema dos atendimentos de emergência, que são muitos, né? Como reduzir esse tipo de atendimento? O que na sua área, onde você trabalha, o que é que tem sido feito para conseguir isso aí?
Yes, it's really and indeed a problem of many people coming to the hospital. I think it's the same in this Brazilian situation, that too many patients are coming into the hospital, but they have to be treated at home. You don't want them in the hospital because they can be treated in a home situation. So what we do is we make a network with many institutions around the hospital, like elderly institutions, the general practitioner, also civil organizations, which help to provide a network of healthcare support.
Em situações de emergência.
That's a situation, yes. And if one becomes sick or it's a slight illness, they can call for another institution or another person, not just hospital, and go there. And the person will come into the home situation, make a diagnosis and treat them at home. So that makes it more better for the patient itself. That's the most important part, because elderly people don't want to go in the hospital. They really get confused. They get all side effects. The stay of the hospital takes longer than planned. So these are all those problems we don't want it, because it becomes more and more expensive and it's not good for the patient.
Obrigado, Karina. Obrigado, Balestrin. Obrigado, Nick. Obrigado pela participação de vocês.